Thank you, Melissa. Good evening. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this program this evening. Thank you very much for being here. It is also a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker tonight, the Honorable Alan Bersin. I met Alan Bersin several years ago at the University of Texas. Alan is a man who loves the U.S.-Mexico border and loves to talk about North America, and very early on he and I coincided on that particular passion for North America and for the U.S.-Mexico border. I know of very few people who truly understand and feel passionately about the U.S.-Mexico border and can fully integrate a vision for the U.S.-Mexico border. 14 years ago, we already shared that vision, and it is wonderful to receive him here. Alan Bersin is the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs and the Chief Diplomatic Officer in the Office of Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In those capacities, Bersin oversees DHS's international engagement, serves as the principal advisor to the Secretary, Jay Johnson, in all matters pertaining to international affairs, and is responsible for leading the department's strategic planning and policy formulation functions. He currently serves as chair of the Advisory Committee to the International Policy Division Steering Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The rest of the Alan Bersin's bio is in your hands, but I just want to mention that Alan holds an AB in government from Harvard University and a JD from Yale Law School, and of course has vast experience in the subject that he will address tonight. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome Alan Bersin to address the audience. Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, and Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your welcome to the center. Let me kind of line out, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd like to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes and then open up the floor for questions, and I think I'll rely on my trusted colleague Marie Chalkley to let me know when I've run past the time so that we keep the time for dialogue. That will complicate this because I want to spend time on two major themes which I usually do not conflate, but want to combine them here, which is talking about the nature of borders, which are different in the contemporary context, and then talk about how that has affected the notion of homeland security, internal security, and how that has revolutionized the Mexican-U.S. relationship and the relationships on the border. So you'll bear with me. I won't be going through the PowerPoint line by line, which you will prefer, and I do want to cover the thoughts because all of them matter. First, the nature of borders. Second, the concept of U.S.-Mexican relations and the dramatic change that's taken place in the last decade in the relationship between the two countries. And then end with as Tony suggested, with the notion that linked with Mexico and tied to Canada, that is the future for the United States and for its people. And I look forward to my children and grandchildren living in a world in which the American century may be setting, but it's doing so in the context of a North American century that's just emerging, and that we're just beginning to discern the outlines. So without more, let me start in the beginning with the Treaty of Westphalia. So the Treaty of Westphalia actually is key because prior to the 17th century and the ending of the 30 Years' War, basically there were very indistinct borders. There were large masses of empires, but in fact, with the exception of Britain and what was beginning and would become Richelieu's France, there were the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, but there was not, borders were not generally respected, and you could not really tell where one dominion started and where one ended. Really, with the Treaty of Westphalia, you began to see the emergence of the nation state, which ever since has remained the basic unit of governance in our world. We define the nation state as the unit in the international system, and that is defined by borders, by lines on a map, and in the sand that demarcate one nation, where one nation begins and where one ends, and it has been the basic unit for diplomats like the ambassador and to actually negotiate international affairs. What I suggest to you today in a global world in which what is globalization but the 724 movement, instantaneous movement of labor, capital, ideas, images, electrons, that is constantly moving across our world. And if you look at the world, borders are as much about flows as they are about lines on a map. And in fact, what we're talking about are flows of everything: goods, people, ideas, migrants, refugees, concepts, moving toward these definitions of the nation state. And then they are processed by each nation state at the borderline. But in fact, today, much more important in some ways than the lines on a map are the flows toward them. This defines, this is a depiction of shipping routes. And you will see in history, let me see if this will work on that screen. No. Well, yeah. So you can tell in terms of the flows from East Asia toward North America and across the Pacific, or the transatlantic trade routes, or here's the trade from Asia. That is defines a lot of our geopolitics and a lot of our international affairs. I submit to you that in the next generation, you're going to see a lot more going on in the Indian Ocean in terms of flows. But the point is that these are the flows of the shipping and logistical lines. Another depiction of this in terms of the ports and the movement among the ports. This is a similar depiction of air traffic in the contemporary world. We now have 2.14 billion air passengers, growing in one decade to 3.5 billion. We've grown from 25 million flights to 35 million flights in that same period. But the point is that less important than the lines on the map are the movements between the countries. This is a similar depiction of international phone call metadata in terms of the frequency of calls. This is a circular visualization, and this would show you the amount of phone traffic between Mexico and the United States is the most dense metadata reflection of international phone calls. Again, flows of electrons, flows of messages, much more defining of the modern world than the nation states which are receiving them. And we, to be sure, together with lawful flows, we have illicit flows, traceable to narcotics, illicit finance, unauthorized migration, terrorism, and counterfeit goods. And this is an analyst's depiction of the interaction and the flows of illicit flows moving through the world in the underworld of globalization, in the dark net and elsewhere. So you get the picture, so to speak. There's been a recent book by Parag Khanna, a Singaporean intellectual, which is sort of it's called connectography, and it's the beginning analysis of how these flows connect up and the metropolises that actually will dominate. And what he depicts here are a whole series of the flows through the arrows of maritime traffic, road networks, and the way in which they are defining the modern world, in some ways, as I say, more than the nation state itself. So we talk about borders as lines on a map, but also flows across the world. What I want to discuss with you briefly tonight is how that's affected the way in which we look at borders after 9/11. Because remember what happened on 9/11 after the World Trade Centers come down, and particularly Texans will appreciate this. What happened was we basically shut the borders down. We shut the airports down. Airplanes were not permitted to come in. To get across the U.S.-Mexican border, we had waits going 15 and 20 miles south into Mexico. We measured wait times not by segments of an hour, but by 4, 5, 6, 7 hours to cross the border. That was the reaction that our nation had to the trauma of having our borders violated. After all, for much of American history, we had been protected by the oceans. We were Fortress America, with the exception of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and in fact that was outside the continent of the United States. Our borders had not been violated since the British burned Washington during the War of 1812. So that we reacted to this by retreating behind borders as fortresses, as barriers, and we soon realized that if we would maintain that attitude, President Bush realized, and certainly was informed by President Fox and by Prime Minister Harper, that in fact if we had continued hunkering down and closing our borders, that we would have delivered to Al-Qaeda the victory they sought, which was the destruction of the contemporary and modern economy and society we had built. So we needed to make an adjustment, but the question was, okay, what do you do in terms of protecting the borders? So we really, in the last 15 years, in a bipartisan achievement that does not get much credit, either as an achievement or as being bipartisan, we've actually evolved a Homeland Security doctrine that is quite sound and balanced, and has permitted an increase in security without giving us 100% guarantees, which do not exist in the world, although we've not been doing a good job in communicating that to our people. More about that later. But what we learned very quickly, and I learned when I was the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, was that we still were looking at borders as being the first line of defense. And we soon learned on Christmas Day 2009 that it really is the last line of defense. Now, you remember Abdul Muttalib bought a plane ticket in Ghana, flew from Ghana and then through Lagos to Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, then got on a Northwest airliner flight and intended to blow himself up over Detroit and failed, but he had been identified by Customs and Border Protection through a series of data searches as a person of interest. He would have been pulled into secondary at Wayne County International Airport, but we realized that the system, we had actually prepared for the wrong event, that in fact our system was geared to pulling people into secondary, looking at the borderline as the first line of defense, and he would have completed his terrorist act before he got to the borders. So we suddenly realized that, in fact, borders begin where the flows begin, and that we needed to secure the flow of people toward the homeland, toward the borderline, at the point of origin, and that Schiphol Airport was, for all intents and purposes, the border. And we've since revised our entire system such that we now, at Homeland Security, we have the third largest footprint abroad of any agency, civilian agency, after the State Department, the agency, and the Defense Department. DHS has more people working abroad than most of us actually realize in the States. We saw the same thing 10 months later with regard to cargo. This was the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had stuffed PETN explosives into printer cartridges, had placed them on cargo planes, and had flown, intended to blow them up over Chicago. Now, these were 2 packages from Yemen addressed to synagogues in Chicago. Trust me, as the commissioner of CBP, we would have looked at those. But again, we would have looked at them at the mail depot in O'Hare, and we would have not succeeded in stopping the terrorist plot. So again, the idea was to secure at the point of origin, not at the point of entry. So how do we do that? What we did learn was that, and we've now seen it with ISIL and Daesh in protecting the homeland against the effort to the terrorist efforts to terrorize our population. We recognize that Homeland Security is intrinsically transnational, that there is not an event that happens in the homeland, adverse, that does not have a cause or an effect that's generated abroad, which follows in a global world. In a world of flows, the flows start and they end up hitting the homeland, whether they are hurricanes or terrorist plots, but that we actually have to look to work abroad with our foreign partners based on intelligence that we gather to interdict the threat before it arrives at the homeland. The other thing that we learned is that, and we did this in the United States in the Bush administration, was that we could not continue to have fragmented border management. So when I was the so-called border czar in the Clinton years, operating out of San Diego as the U.S. attorney responsible for law enforcement, coordinating law enforcement, at every one of our 327 ports of entry, airports, seaports, land ports, we had 3 port directors. We had the customs director from the Department of Treasury. We had the immigration director from the Department of Justice. And we had the agricultural director from the Department of Agriculture. Because we had history had deposited different functions in each of these agencies, and nobody wanted to give up the jurisdiction or the budget or the political clout that came with it. And it was only after the trauma of 9/11 that we were able to generate the political energy necessary to make the change. This point, and here's where I'll start to move quickly through the slides. You cannot manage this separately or in fragmented fashion. You have to cooperate with the private sector to share information with foreign nations and across the U.S. government. And one of the projects that Professor Payan is pursuing is this notion of how do we govern border lines? How do we govern border lines? And he's discovered that borders are actually at the line but far away from the line. And how are we going to create institutional relationships to make it work? More later when we come to Mexico. So let me describe some of the theory of action on managing borders. We all believe that security and moving lawful trade and travel are mutually exclusive variables. That is to say, if you want more security crossing the border with a cargo, you by definition have to slow down the traffic. More security means slowing down the traffic so you can look at each car, look at each person. And we've operated on that until the change in paradigm that's occurred. And we now realize that security and expediting lawful trade and travel is actually a single process. And it follows, because if you think about the flows that we showed, 97 to 98% of the flows are perfectly lawful. Only 2% present any high risk. So when we classify and segment lawful traffic, we actually are increasing the security profile. And let me tell you what it's like. Because after all, if 2% of the traffic presents a high risk, looking for the threat is really looking for a needle in a haystack. And how do you find a needle in a haystack? There are three ways of doing this. Either you look at every piece of straw in the haystack, and that's what we did after 9/11, and we realized that would be self-defeating. Can't look at every piece of straw to try to find the needle. You can use very specific intelligence to reach into the haystack, because the intelligence tells you where the needle is. And in fact, that's what happened in the Yemen cargo plot involving the packages with PE-10 explosives. Saudi Arabian intelligence had informed American intelligence that, in fact, there were two packages that were on their way to the United States that contained explosives. And working with the private sector and with our foreign partners, we reached into the supply chain of millions of packages and found the two packages and were able to do that. And while, in fact, our intelligence is increasingly impressively more effective than it was around the years of 9/11, you still can't rely on intelligence day by day to manage the volumes of the flows of people and goods. So the third way in which you can find the needle in a haystack is by making the haystack smaller. And the way you make the haystack smaller is you identify those people and goods that are low risk, and you segment them out and you expedite them through the borderline so that you can focus your attention on those people and those cargoes that either present a high risk because of derogatory information you know, or you don't have sufficient information to make a judgment about whether or not they are high risk. So how many of you here are members of the Global Entry Program from CBP? So you get that. This is about providing information about yourself that permits the government to qualify you as a low-risk traveler, which permits you to move in an expedited form through the airport. And the benefit for the security agency is that at any particular resource allocation level, it improves our ability by focusing on those persons who we have not pre-cleared as low risk. We do that now in every dimension of Homeland Security, because it's about risk management and using big data and advanced information to make judgments about whether or not the cargo or the persons, or increasingly the cyber flows, present high risk and need to be given special attention. It is the way in which we manage the border. Advance information to make risk judgments and then to segment the traffic accordingly. So one of the other lessons that we've learned from this evolution of theories of action is that what we were all taught by our mothers or early teachers, or some on the streets of Brooklyn, is that information is power. That in fact, information is power. And it still is power, but in the global digital age, the lesson that we drew from it a generation ago is no longer applicable. What we believed in the past was that information is power, so hold the information to yourself, don't share it. And if someone wants the information you have, you need to extract something from them in order to give them the information. In a digital world with the multiple sources of information, online and otherwise, those who do not share information will soon be isolated and left behind, and it's only those who share information so that they can compare their data against other data that you will be able to then make usable and actionable information more readily. In short, you will be able to connect the dots. That is a lesson that in the international realm, most countries, most agencies in the United States don't appreciate, but it is clearly the wave of the future. Those that share data will be in a better position to protect themselves because of the ability to make actionable information out of the data that they have. And maybe someone will ask me a tough question in the question and answer about privacy, so I'll hold that for then. So let me now go through the application to Mexico and do this in abbreviated form, but Texans know this. It wasn't, what was that great movie a generation ago, Lone Star? Mexicans and Texans have always had a very, very important relationship. In fact, so much of the Rio Grande Valley was impermeable or permeable in terms of the movement of music and culture and people. And after 9/11, there was a change, but actually, from the Mexican perspective, there was always a focus on the borderline, La Linea, that divided Mexico and the United States. And the reason for that was that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, actually as a result of the U.S.-Mexican War, half of Mexican territory was ceded to the United States by the treaty. And that, together with what had happened a decade earlier, 12 years earlier with the creation of Texas, actually made Mexicans, it was a source of great concern and anger toward the United States. It was complicated by the fact that most Americans never realized that most of the western United States had belonged to Mexico, and most Mexicans have never forgotten it. So that, in fact, while we had friendly relations, for the most part, Mexico protected its industry, big barriers in terms of tariffs, and in fact, at the border, La Linea was asserted very aggressively, and it was not so easy to cooperate on the border. So everything on the surface of the diplomats was friendly, but under the underlying official relationship was actually quite cold and very formal in terms of the way business was conducted. So you can track that in terms of the Mexican, U.S.-Mexican relationship. Alan Riding wrote a famous book called Distant Neighbors that really described this relationship. We happened to be neighbors, but we were really quite distant in terms of the way we interacted. When I first moved to Southern California in the late 80s, early 90s, matrons in La Jolla, which is the fancy community maybe 18 miles from the U.S.-Mexican border, they used to come out in the morning and say, I wonder what the weather's like in Tijuana. These were two separate communities living within one region. The Zimmerman telegram, I'll answer that too in question and answer. It's an interesting chapter of U.S.-Mexican history. So we had lots of finger pointing. Mexicans would say, the Americans would say, you can't control the flow of drugs to our border. And Mexicans would say, if you didn't consume more drugs than any people in history, you wouldn't have that problem. We had problems on immigration. Illegal immigration, and yet Mexicans would say, you Americans, you complain about illegal immigration, but you like cheap labor. You want people in your neighborhoods and in your homes. So it was back and forth endlessly. And frankly, the borderland was left alone by both Mexico City and Washington. It's far away. And people didn't pay attention to it in terms of national policy. It was a place of collision and for forces generated elsewhere. And the 10 to 12, now 15 million people, nosotros fronterizos, that used to live on the border, we loved it, but we weren't supported. And national politics would play havoc with what was happening on the border, claiming things that were simply not true. That happens from time to time in American politics. So this was the border when I became the U.S. Attorney in 1993. This is what the border looked like between Tijuana and San Diego. It was a no man's land, and that year more than 1 million Mexican migrants were arrested and returned just in the San Diego sector itself. Last year, 40,000 Mexican migrants were arrested in the San Diego sector. So the new Mexico reality that builds on the new conception of borders and the new ways in which we manage our border is really quite extraordinary. And it grew out of, as I say, President Bush and President Fox were aware that if lines would stretch back into Mexico from Texas for 10 or 12 or 15 miles, and commerce was shut down and trucks could not cross from Laredo, there would be economic consequences. And it was largely the border, the management of border trade that led to the new theories of action that we've now applied all over the world to cargo and people. But it began here on the U.S.-Mexican border, and with great reference to the border crossings in Texas. So nobody in Texas needs to be told how important the flows are now in terms of goods and people. We have a massive trade in the corridors between Coahuila, Tamaulipas, and Chihuahua and Texas. The numbers are up there, and they are extraordinary. 1 million border crossings of people daily, 17 million Mexican visitors to the U.S., 25 million U.S. residents visited Mexico. Mexico is we are now trading $1 million a minute. $1 million a minute with Mexico, just under 700 billion a year, and it's growing, and it's continuing to grow. This economic reality, which actually was a function of NAFTA, negotiated by the first President Bush and implemented by President Clinton, is now kicked around as though it has done great harm to our country. To the contrary, there have been dislocations caused by NAFTA, but the building up of U.S.-Mexican trade and U.S.-Canadian trade is one of the astounding changes that's taken place in our economy over the last generation. So the reality of the relationship has actually compelled the governments to act in ways that, unlike the previously formal and official, polite but not terribly cooperative relationship that existed for much of U.S.-Mexican history, I can assure you that in fact the relationship is productive, cooperative, And the kinds of information flows that we have between our two countries is something that is extraordinary. In cooperation with perimeter security, every airline passenger who enters Mexico from any place in the world is actually checked against U.S. holdings to see whether or not we're dealing with a organized criminal element or a known or suspected terrorist. I can assure you that that would not have been the case 10 years ago. We manage migration. One of the misconceptions of American politics now is that Mexican migration remains a huge factor. More Mexicans left the country last year than entered the country. More Mexicans left the country, the United States, than entered the country legally and illegally. In fact, most of the people being arrested in the southern part of your state are actually Central Americans in the Rio Grande Valley. 85% of the arrests, or 80 or 85%, are Central Americans, not Mexicans. As Professor Payan's data shows, most of the immigration that we're seeing that stays is actually perfectly legal immigration and has to do with middle-class Mexicans coming to live in the United States, business people. So we manage this together with Mexican authorities. We've organized repatriation regimes that actually are jointly managed and coordinated, as opposed to us simply dropping Mexicans off at the border without any notice to Mexican authorities. And the point is, in summary, that borders are not places for collision and conflict, although they can be, but they are opportunities for cooperation and coordination. And we do things that we would never have thought possible. I pointed out in a panel discussion before this presentation, we have U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers in Mexico pre-clearing cargo so that it doesn't have to stop at the border when it gets to California or Texas. Mexican Customs has its officers in Laredo Airport pre-clearing cargo going to Mexico so that when the cargo gets into Mexico, it does not have to be cleared in Mexico by Mexican Customs. We consult and coordinate on the building of ports of entry. We have processes in which we say and determine where are we going to build the next port of entry. Again, unprecedented cooperation driven by real self-interest. So, as we go forward, I want to talk to you about taking what is going on between Mexico and the United States and how it will affect us in the next generation. So, big problems in the Northern Triangle and Central America. Most of the migrations coming out of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Violence, poverty, driving people out. We need, there will be an investment of $1 billion to start the process of rebuilding security and linking Central America to the North American powerhouse that's emerging. It will take a generation, but remember, a generation ago, we had a far different Mexico. Mexico today is the 13th largest economy in the world. And the OECD in Paris predicts that in one generation, 2045, it will have a larger economy than Germany. It will be the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. Mexico, 50% of Mexicans today, by any measure, education, housing, healthcare, fertility, is middle class. Now, some of that is, people are on the edge, and depending on the Mexican economy can slide back, as many Americans have. But in fact, 50% of Mexicans are middle class by any measure. The fertility rate has gone down to 2.1 births per woman, compared to 6.7 in the 1970s. This is a middle class, increasingly middle class society. And Mexico by the way, is now a very robust democracy. They don't have hanging chads in their elections. And in fact, any observer will see that there is a robust, very robust political debate in the Congress and in the press. So Mexico is not what it used to be. And more Americans need to know that. And that's what the plan is, that eventually, if in the next generation, and it will take 40 or 50 years, we will want to see Central America linked to that economic and social growth path, but we're going to have to work at it together with Mexico. This is the point on migration, stocks, and flows. The large bar is the number of people living in this country, and most of them are Central American, coming in recently, not Mexican, although 8 million Mexicans from previous migration are Mexicans, which is why everyone agrees that we need immigration reform. We haven't yet figured out or reached agreement on what it would look like, although we came close 2 or 3 years ago. And I will hazard to guess that whoever is president is going to have to confront this, and deporting 8 million people is not simply consistent with our resource capacity or with our history as a people. That last point is an editorial, I will concede. But the flows will continue. This is the truck flow through Mexico, Canada, and Mexico and the United States and into Canada. This is the Parag-Kana connectography showing the connections growing among Canadian, U.S., and Mexican cities. And this will intensify. And most of the trade and most of the capital formation is taking place among 15 or 18 cities in North America that will dominate the growth over the course of the next generation. Well, I think, let's see. Well, let me finish. That's probably a good signal that my slides have the clicker's not functioning. But let me make the point on North America. So North America is, I said it at the outset, the American century of dominance and domination is actually drawing to a close. I don't see that as a case of American decline. We're not disappearing, contrary to what people say. But we are positioning ourselves to emerge as part of a North America that has unparalleled assets in a difficult world. So we have 30% of the global domestic product is actually North American, Canadian, US, Mexican. There we go. We have 500 million people, 500 million people, living in borders that are demilitarized. Think about the situation in Turkey. Think about Turkey's neighbors, 8 neighbors. We don't have one set of borders that's militarized or that is unfriendly and hostile. This is true from Colombia to the Arctic. Not one border that is in which we have a military threat presented. We now have relationships with Canada and Mexico that have been parallel bilateral. So we had the Obama-Harper Beyond the Border Action Plan, and we had the Calderon, Peña Nieto, Obama, Mexican 21st century border Mexican arrangement. These are very deep, coordinated plans between the governments, but they've been operating in parallel fashion. What we're going to see over the next generation is more and more the emergence of North America, consistent with the flows that we've talked about in the last 40 minutes. We're going to see a North American approach to this, and it will actually encompass Colombia, where, by the way, Plan Colombia and the recent peace that President Santos negotiated to end the 50 years of a terrorist threat an extraordinary society, and Colombia will regain its place as a major element and an important influence both in South America, but it's also the bridge. It's the bridge for us to South America, but it's also, after all, until Teddy Roosevelt created Panama for purpose of creating the canal, Panama was part of Colombia. So we need to look at Colombia being part of North America, and the Arctic, that recent cruise boat that went through the Northwest Passage, enormous implications. Because with the flows of goods and people, and while climate change has many detrimental effects, actually it will open up a huge travel zone and transit zone in the Northwest Passage across from Asia to North America. So I think the future is North America, and it should give us as Americans a certain amount of comfort, so long as we can stop thinking that we're the only North Americans, and that in fact todos somos norteamericanos, and I'm going to have to learn how to say that in French. We are all North Americans, and that North America will be a security enhancement for us, an economic enhancement for us, a financial enhancement for us, and a plus in every way. I don't mean to suggest that there aren't challenges, but the biggest challenge, as the French poet Paul Valéry said, is the biggest challenge we face is that the future is not what it used to be. Thank you very much. So,
there are microphones here, and so if you line up in this aisle and that aisle, we'll take some questions. Here we go. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Jimmy Dunn. I'm a retired middle school and math teacher. I want to say I admire you for being a superintendent of the San Diego schools. We need more good people in education. But I wanted to ask you about NAFTA. Donald Trump has said it's a terrible deal. He would tear it up. He wants to build a big wall between the U.S. and Mexico. And I'm concerned myself about it. It seems to me like the drug cartels run Mexico. So I'd like to hear you talk about that. But tell us how you evaluate NAFTA and how you might improve it in the future, and how you would tell Donald Trump that he's all wrong about this.
Yes, sir. So NAFTA was not perfect. No free trade deal is, but actually free trade is a little bit of a misnomer. It's trade according to reduced and liberalized rules. But the fact of the matter is it's had the economic benefits for both countries. What has clearly been the case, though, is that there is a dislocation of manufacturing jobs in the beginning. But I think there's been a persuasive case made that most of the manufacturing jobs that we're losing now are actually a function of the automating of factory process, not NAFTA, not free trade. It's that we're basically producing much more with fewer workers because of the machining process and the ability to do 3D printing, which, as a former educator, thank you for acknowledging that. The reason I got interested in education is we do have to retrain people. The community colleges do need to equip people for the economy that we have, not the one that we had before. But look, I think without responding to the political rhetoric about we're going to renegotiate these deals or that the deals have been bad, they've had many benefits for us. On the whole, a big plus, with many significant downsides that have to be addressed for certain portions of our population and certain regions of our country. No doubt about that. But the notion that we can move back to a world that is not flows, I think is an ostrich-like approach to contemporary events.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I mean, no question that NAFTA has been a success from an economic standpoint. What I'm trying to figure out is how secure is the southern border vis-a-vis Homeland Security?
Yeah.
And there must be surveys of like Border Patrol agents. Do they have what they need, or do they feel like they're accomplishing what needs to be done? What is their opinion about this wall idea?
So, sir, this is a thank you for asking that, because I will tell you that I've been involved with the U.S.-Mexican border for 25 years now. Well, 22 anyway. The biggest gap, and I've actually lived through the period in the Clinton administration, then observed it as a living on the border in the Bush administration, and now in the Obama administration coming back. So the border is, and I will say this, the border is more secure than it's ever been in the time I've been watching it. The number of people who were arrested trying to cross illegally into the country in 2000 was 1.6 million people, and today there are 350,000 people being arrested. And yet we can actually say, the issue is the border secure? We have, when I started on the border in 1993, we had 2,700 Border Patrol agents, and only 300 in the San Diego sector. We have 22,000 Border Patrol agents today, 19,000 of whom are on our southern border. And the problem is not people coming in. I think that I would say that the problem is that there's a gap between the facts on the ground and the perception. And people like me, and I take responsibility in part, because the model that we've actually portrayed to the American people is a totally sealed, that if I say that 100,000 people entered the country illegally, I think we'd have to say that, the republic's not at risk so long as terrorists don't get in. Right? We don't want the southern border to be a place where ISIL can dispatch terrorists. But if you said 100,000 people slipped in on the border over the course of the last year, I'd really have to say, is that a deep national security threat? But that's not, because the image that we've actually portrayed and projected to people is that that's a problem. That's a big problem. Now, it's a problem. I'm not denying that, but this idea that we have zero tolerance for border crossings is as ephemeral a promise to say that we're going to have zero border crossings, even if we increase the Border Patrol to 50,000. So, sir, I say it's a security issue that we have to be concerned about, but the southern border is not the border that I certainly knew a generation ago, 20 years ago. It's in much better shape, and it's, from my standpoint, the greatest bipartisan achievement that nobody wants to take credit for in either party. This is a continuous, we've spent $18 billion a year in taxpayer money on strengthening the southern border from the beginning of the Clinton administration through the Bush administration into the Obama administration. $18 billion a year. As Everett Dirksen would say, that's real money. And it's produced a result. Has it produced a perfect result? Has it produced a border that's sealed? Do we shoot people the way the Russian border guards, East German border guards used to? No. But is it an acceptable, a satisfactory state of the border? My judgment, sir, is yes. That doesn't mean that we don't have work to do. We do. But the border is not what it used to be, and unfortunately, our politics doesn't reflect that. And that's the responsibility of leaders like myself who haven't made it clear.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for a great presentation. My name is Juan Vasquez, and I represent the maquiladora industry in Mexico. I just arrived here this morning, so I also want to thank you for the perception that you shared with us on Mexico's economy today. My question is more in concern to what do you foresee is going to happen post-elections with the border, regardless who wins? Yeah. I mean, there's already effects caused by the campaigns. So how do you see this relationship with trade merchandise and the people of the border post-election on the short term.
Yeah. So the political rhetoric aside, and without projecting anything, the reality of the relationship actually has a lot of weight. I can't imagine anyone coming in and saying we're going to go back to the 9/11 border and we're going to really shut down the border because we couldn't. The people of Texas wouldn't stand for it. So I don't see. I think the question is how far do we go in making the border even more efficient and better serving the people on both sides. That's the issue. Is it's going to be the pace of change. In Professor Payan's in the seminar, we talked about a border in which there is increased bilateral cooperation, in which we are working together to solve problems. Because, in fact, to compete against East Asia, to compete against India, South Asia, and Indonesia in the economic in the global economic competition, we don't want to compete with people on the basis of wage rates. We want to compete with people on the basis of quality and logistical efficiency. That's where our competitive economic advantage is, quality, and that we can actually handle the production of goods in a more efficient way. 40%, so all of this trade that goes back and forth on the border that you're so engaged in, 40% of the value of everything we receive from Mexico is actually generated in the United States by processes here. We do not, we avoided historically going the European route of an experiment in shared sovereignty. But what we have are shared production platforms. So every time a car rolls off an assembly plant in Guanajuato and is brought up to be sold in Texas or Ontario, the parts to build that car have been 3 or 4 times back and forth across the border. That's the source of the strength, and I don't think anyone is in a position to change that, even if they wanted to. Yes,
yes. Thank you for your remarks. This is not aimed at all in terms of U.S.-Mexico relations at Mexico. Really, it's the shoe's on the other foot in terms of my question, which is which was highlighted by the recent decision on HSBC and the decision not to prosecute by the Department of Justice. Right. And the House Finance Services Committee, the Republican staff of that committee, issued a report. And that's been in the press since mid-July. But of course, similar Bank of America, Wachovia, JP Morgan Chase, and so forth, isn't this really a major security issue? You're not the Department of Justice, but nonetheless it bears on your responsibilities.
Yeah, no.
And the second part of my question is somewhat different, but it's related, is it's amazing that today China is a much larger investor into Latin America, Ibero-America, than the United States, including capital investment. And I just wondered if you had some comments, since we're talking about NAFTA and so forth. This is more related to the U.S.-Mexico border, but more broadly in terms of the global picture you were referencing earlier. If you had some comments on that.
Yeah, so just to start on the last, yes, Chinese investment flows are massive because Chinese capital accumulation has been massive. A lot of that has taken place in, as you say, South America and Africa, although the levels in the last 2 years and for the foreseeable future is actually quite decreasing. But that, those are capital investments, and I don't see those as a threat, because in fact the Chinese will then find themselves being the ugly Chinese. in ways that they're going to have to deal with as they emerge as a major power. Money laundering and illicit finance, big problem. Nobody denies that. But we have more cooperation between the Department of Justice and the PGR in terms of confronting it, and the rules need to be enforced, and they need to go forward. And I will say, and my Mexican colleagues know this, the biggest challenge that Mexico faces right now is to have to deal with the problem of corruption. And I give my Mexican friends the Doris Kearns Goodwin, after she wrote the book on Lincoln, the Team of Rivals. She wrote a book called The Bully Pulpit. And it's good for Americans to go back and read that, because what it shows is that at the end of the 19th century, before Teddy Roosevelt started, the muckrakers started writing, we had a corruption situation that was arguably worse than the one Mexico has today. The railroads owned the state houses in 40 states. Congress was controlled by special interests. And then the issue is, how did the United States actually, over the course of time, deal with the issue of corruption, which was institutionalized in our country, lest anyone think we were born untainted. We weren't. And in fact, we now still have much corruption, but it's not systematic of the kind that you still see in Mexico. So I take your point on the banking issues. It's an issue, but for the first time, I think we can say, as I said in the context of security, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not an oncoming train. Yes, sir.
With all the improvement that you described in the American-Mexican border, what was the effect on the transfer of illicit drugs?
So the illicit drugs are a massive problem. They are no question. They continue to be a massive problem in terms of both the consumption, the level of consumption of drugs in this country, which remains unacceptably high, extraordinarily high, and the inability of Mexican law enforcement and its legal system to clamp down and destroy the mafia. What actually, as we were saying earlier, Mexico has actually done a pretty good job in taking down the kingpins. I mean, if they were so incompetent, they wouldn't have recaptured Chapo Guzman, who will be extradited in due course to the United States. They've actually taken down 120 mini Chapo Guzmans over the last number of years, and that's led to a fragmentation of the gangs, which presents certain other problems. But illegal drug traffic is a problem. But the fact is, where that dominated the dialogue between our countries 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it doesn't dominate the dialogue. We work together, not seamlessly, to deal with it. It will be a continuing problem. But for example, the issue that we're now dealing with in the United States on heroin, the heroin addiction rates, we have serious discussions going on with Mexico about how are we going to confront this? How can we cooperate in dealing with the opiate addiction, both by pills and then the recourse to heroin? So yes, big problem, no question about it, but not something that keeps us from moving ahead in many ways. And for the first time, we have genuine channels of communication on trying to solve these problems together.
Recent attacks in Europe and also in the US have shown that homegrown terrorists is a new trend that's happening in the world, which borders will not be able to protect you from. Which do you think should be the strategy that Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. should follow to prevent homegrown terrorists to continue causing attacks?
So Secretary Johnson, I think it's clear that there are two threats, and we say the Homeland Security, that there is nothing that happens in the homeland that is not caused or affected by an event abroad. We have been spared so far having terrorist cells that have been inserted into the country the way they were in 9/11. And we have not dealt with a ISIL organized, directed, and equipped group that is sent here to commit a terrorist act. But we do have people who have been inspired by the propaganda and by the jihadist theology that is online and posted by Daesh. And that has led to homegrown, inspired from abroad, violent extremist action in San Bernardino, in Garland, Texas, in Orlando, Florida. We have to approach that, by doing what we have to do. We have to destroy Daesh so that the snake that spews the venom is dealt with, and that's one that our military and our diplomats are working on, and I believe will happen, not as fast as we'd like, but it will happen. But in the meantime, we have to actually work on countering violent extremism, and that's a major emphasis of our government, is to work to understand communities, the forces that are radicalizing people online, and to work with local communities and local police departments and local community NGOs to actually confront the threat, both by identifying people who've been radicalized, but also by preventing as many as we can from being radicalized. That's the nature of the counterterrorist threat.
We'll take those two questions together. I will add one,
okay,
and we can close there. So here, and then here.
Okay.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for this interesting conference. My name is Daniel Aguilar. I do work for the legal department of the Consulate General of Mexico in the city of Houston. And the question is this one, sir. We've seen in recent years that many Mexicans come to the United States, at least to both of the Houston airports, and many times when CBP refused them the entrance to the territory of the United States, we know that even if they have visa to apply to an entrance to the United States, CBP is allowed to deny them the entrance. But what we've seen, sir, is that as part of the examination that the CBP officers perform in such cases, they ask these passengers if they are afraid to be sent back to their country. And many times due to the extreme conditions and the fear that they're facing at the time, they say yes, and they're suddenly held by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they are not aware of the fact that they're actually requesting a political asylum in the United States. And we are aware of the fact that most Mexicans do not qualify to asylum in the United States, and have the feeling that many times the CBP questions are misleading them. And we have been trying to reach the heads of the CBP in the area in order to help them to avoid or at least reduce this situation, but we have not had success. The question is, what would you recommend us as part of the DHS in order to work in this situation?
So in Dallas, I would actually go to see the port director, because simply asking that question, getting an answer yes, is not a request for asylum. So there's something that's not tracking. But I would make an appointment with the port director at the airport and express the concern, because it sounds to me like it could be easily resolved, because I don't think, that's not the way the asylum process works.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Over here. Yes, last question.
Well, I thought there should be a little equal time for my gender, so Anyway, well, thank you so much for your presentation. And as a fellow, I appreciate, I'm a fellow educator also at different levels throughout my life. This summer, I took a trip to Eastern Canada and found out they had a history too that was somewhat parallel to what was going on in the history of the U.S. And was appalled that I kind of didn't realize that for all these years. My question deals with this. You talk about that we will no longer be just the United States of America. You know, we will not necessarily be so predominant, but North America will be predominant. And do you ever envision our educational system addressing this, where we teach the history of of our continent, not just the history of our country?
No question. So I was at a wedding in Toronto this weekend, and I should, in fairness to my Canadian friends, I should point out that the British burned Washington in 1812, in the War of 1812, but only because the Americans had burned York, which was then the capital of Canada, beforehand. So your point is well taken. I've always said when we were celebrating in 2012, it was the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, and it was being celebrated in both countries as a victory. And I said the wonderful thing about the U.S.-Canadian relationship is that we teach our children that each country teaches its children that it won the War of 1812, and it doesn't seem to be a big point of contention. But the fact is that, so just so you know how that happened, when Benedict Arnold and others, we tried to invade Canada, as apparently you've learned, we were completely rebuffed by British forces from taking hold. Americans believe we won the War of 1812 because Andrew Jackson rebuffed and defeated the British in the Battle of New Orleans, which actually took place 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent, that it ended the war. But the treaty was coming across the ocean, and nobody knew it. So I know people lost their lives at the Battle of New Orleans, so I don't say this lightly. But had that Treaty of Ghent arrived, we couldn't have claimed that we won the War of 1812.
But I think about like our school system with Mexico too, not just Canada.
Yeah.
Teaching our our tri-joint history.
So the fact is that academia, right, and textbooks lag more than anything else where the facts are. It will take a while before people realize that, in fact, it's a North American history. And I should say, by the way, obviously the United States is going to play a major role. We're not going to have a confederation. We're going to be separate sovereignties, but we're going to be, consistent with the flows analysis, we're going to be an economic and increasingly socially integrated group. But, I thank you for your service as an educator.
Well, I just think of the future, the children of the future growing up thinking this way if we educate them this way.
Yes, ma'am.
One more thing. I want you to go away without addressing the wall.
Yeah.
In one minute, there is increasing evidence that there are environmental consequences to the wall, the flora and the fauna, and the ability of these animals to circulate in their habitat and so on. And then there's, of course, a threat of increasing that mileage from 650 to 2,000. What do you see there?
So as you know, Tony, I've been blessed. My friends and colleagues in the audience, if you can do it, and you really can do it, you should really start off in Brownsville and drive to San Diego. Should do that and drive along the southern route. The fact is that in the 1,900 miles that make up the U.S.-Mexican border, we have a wall or a fence along much of it. So we don't have, we have the Normandy barriers out in the desert. We don't need a 50-foot wall. because as Secretary Napolitano, Governor Napolitano and Secretary Napolitano said, if you build a 50-foot wall, someone will find a 51-foot ladder. So it's about managing the flows and doing a risk analysis. And where we actually have very high compelling walls, or where we, around the urban areas, to actually manage the flow of people so that people can't just walk into downtown El Paso across the river, or they can't just walk as they did into San Diego from Tijuana during the early years. But out in the desert, what we want to prevent are just truckloads of drugs or truckloads of people coming through, and there's a pretty effective barrier. So independent of the environmental damage, which would be clear, I say this, it's building a wall to keep out what? Most of the people, as I say, we have fewer number of people being arrested at the border than we've had in 3 decades. And you have to say, so what are we talking about? What is the wall but a throwback to the Westphalian days where we thought that the border's the first line of defense, that we're going to build a wall and we're going to keep out the way the Chinese try to keep out the Mongols in the 2nd century BC by building a wall. That's not consistent with the world, and I would submit not consistent either with the environmental health or with the social health. We're not a people that hides behind walls. We're not a people that is afraid to look out and engage. We're doing it, and if the wall accomplished a sealing of the border, I would be prepared to engage in a debate. But it's not even going to accomplish the stated aim that it claims because of the 51-foot ladder. So, let alone the burrowing under the wall, let alone the punching holes through the wall. I know he's going to build a good wall. I say that because I can't believe that would ever happen, let alone that the Mexicans would pay for it. Thank you. Thank you very much.